A reading from Psalm 107. O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those he redeemed from trouble, and gathered from the lands, from the east and the west, from the north and from the south. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to an inhabited town, hungry and thirsty, their souls fainted from within. They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way, until they reached an inhabited town. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. For he satisfies the thirsty, and fills the hungry with good things. Some sat in darkness and in gloom, prisoners in misery and in irons, for they had rebelled against the words of God, and spurned the counsel of the Most High. Their hearts were bowed down with hard labor. They fell down with no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and gloom, and broke their bonds asunder. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. Here ends the readings. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. I don't know about you, but many times when I drive, it's kind of on autopilot. These days, it's mostly a drive between the house and the church, and I do it so often and so much that I just kind of don't even think about it. My mind is elsewhere as I'm driving, and one part of my mind is just keeping out watch for a hazard where I might have to take consciousness and take control again. This path has become so ingrained that even when I go somewhere else, I will often find myself on the way to church before I realize that I need to change direction because I'm not going to church, I'm going somewhere else. Part of that is because we have an incredible infrastructure of roads that enables us not to think about how we get from one place to another. I remember several years ago, I took Sasha back to university when we were living in Colorado. University was the University of Montana in Missoula. And to get there was a 1,000-mile drive on the freeway, up I-25 and then west along I-90. But I confess to having a wanderlust at times, and I did not want to take the fast and easy way back. Turns out that US 287 begins in Helena, Montana, bisects I-90 just east of the Continental Divide, goes down into Yellowstone National Park, and then goes diagonally southeast towards Colorado and pops up on the Front Range, just where we live. So I decided to follow it. And it was a marvelous drive, driving through Yellowstone by myself. And then there was a stretch of road between Moran Junction on the Snake River and DuBois on the Wind River, where they were engaging in road reconstruction, tearing the whole road apart and paving it anew. And I had to wait for an hour before the pilot car came and we as a convoy could bypass the construction, and they took us through the woods on an old track. And as we were driving slowly, bouncing up and down on this two ruts, I got a new appreciation for what it must have been like in the Old West, traveling from place to place without the benefit of the infrastructure that we have today, and how easy it is to travel. Maybe how easy it was back in those days to get lost. And that got me thinking about, what does it mean to get lost? And I think we have many different experiences of what it means to get lost. Sometimes getting lost can be a marvelous experience. I remember several years ago when I took Thelma to the Black Hills for the first time. We were coming up out of the south in Nebraska and were stopped by severe thunderstorms and had to overnight in a hotel because of flash flooding. When we got on the road to go to the Black Hills, it was blocked off because certain sections of the road were washed out and there were signs indicating a detour. But the detour was off to the east, and really the Black Hills were off to the northwest. And I really didn't want to follow the the well-beaten track. And I had noticed earlier before we got in the car that there was another road going up to the Black Hills to the west. It was unmarked as far as a number. And we found it, and we followed it, and it ended up being a narrow road, about a width and a half of a car, unmarked, no striping on the pavement, and it went over ridge after ridge and valley through the Ogallala grasslands. And as the wind was blowing, you could see how the old pioneers often described the prairie as a moving sea with the grass waving in the wind. And there was one time we came over a ridge and looked down into the valley below, and there was this mass of brown blotch. We couldn't make out what it was. But as we got closer, we saw that it was really a herd of buffalo moving very slowly across the road. And we sat there for an hour watching this herd slowly move in front of us. It was an incredible sight that we had all to ourselves in that vast space. Sometimes getting lost can be marvelous. Sometimes getting lost can be terrifying. I remember when Sasha was 2 years old, we took her to Disney World for the first time. My mother and my sister were living in Orlando at the time. And of course, we followed her around to It's a Small World in Fantasyland, doing the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, all those rides that are geared for little children. And at the end of the day, it was time for dinner. We went into Pinocchio's fast food house, ordered hamburgers for us, a hot dog for Sasha. Sasha was put with my mother and my sister while Thelma and I went to the window to get our food. And when we came back, my mother and my sister were engrossed in conversation, but no Sasha. We looked under the table, no Sasha. We looked all over the restaurant, no Sasha. We walked outside, no Sasha. We walked back inside and told the people working in the restaurant that our daughter had disappeared. Well, they pulled the panic button, the park was shut down, nobody was allowed to leave, and 15 minutes later, security found her riding on the carousel all by herself. We were absolutely heartbroken and stricken, fearing the worst. Getting lost can be terrifying. But if you listen to Sasha, for her, she was never lost. To this day, she asserts she always knew what she was doing. Still, for parents, that kind of lost can break the heart. Sometimes getting lost can be frustrating. I remember when Sasha was 16, we took a trip to Scotland, and part of the subtext of the trip was to find old stone circles. I mean, it was the height of Harry Potter novels being published, and Sasha was very much into reading those novels. And the first one we found when we were staying on the island of Mull was off on the south end of the island. We took off about 10 o'clock in the evening. It was still full daylight. It was this time of year, just after midsummer, so it hardly got dark in Scotland at that latitude. And we found the stone circle down a long one-way road, very narrow, hardly wide enough to turn the car around in between the stone walls. And as we started out into the field, we discovered that it was very muddy, and the shoes that we had were not adequate to make it out to the stone circle, and so we had to turn back in frustration. And as we were doing so, there was this herd of Highland deer that came out of nowhere and started prancing in circles around us, almost laughing at us that they could move in the field and we couldn't. Dejected, we moved back to the car and started back to the hotel, and then boom, a flat tire. Actually, the first of many flat tires on that trip. By this time, it was 11:30 at night. The sun was going down. We were on a dark road with no lights, no farmhouses, no cell service. And changing a flat tire on a rental car in the dark like that was a challenge. Finally, we got back to the hotel about 3 o'clock in the morning, just as the sun was coming up. Sometimes getting lost can be very frustrating. Sometimes getting lost, you find yourself. I remember as a teenager going on a school trip to the Isle of Man, and we stayed in a youth hostel in the small town of Laxey. And one evening, a bunch of us decided that we were going to go walk to Douglas to get some fish and chips for supper. And so we took off. But as luck would have it, my hiking boots came untied, and I stepped down to tie them again. And by the time I stood up again, I noticed I was all alone. My friends didn't even know that I had stopped. And so I followed them until I came to a crossroads and looked at the crossroads with no markings on which way to go, and I didn't have a map with me. And so I had to choose which way they might have gone, which way might be the way to Douglas. Well, I chose wrong. But in that wrong choice, following that road that I didn't know where it was going, I came across an old Celtic monastery that was ruined. And as I stepped off the road to explore the monastery, I heard a voice singing. And I followed that voice through the monastery, through the cloisters, through the rooms, through the refectory, to the old ruined chapel. And there was a small group of people in an evening prayer worship service, and a tenor singing, "How Great Thou Art." It was an incredibly moving moment. And irresistibly, I sat down and listened and participated in the service, and felt at that time such a peace that I had never experienced before. I often return to that moment in my imagination, when there are times when I cannot find my own sacred space, when I need to find that space deep within. And I return to that moment as one of those moments when I was lost, but was found. Getting lost can be frustrating. It can be vexing. It can be terrifying. It can be marvelous. In getting lost, we can sometimes find ourselves. And there are lots and lots of stories in the Bible about getting lost. The people of Israel lost in the wilderness for 40 years. That becomes a paradigm of hope for their descendants, the Jews, as they are lost in exile, remembering that story, hopefully, that God will remember them and find them and bring them home. There is the story of Elijah being lost. Yes, accomplishing great things for God, but feeling alone and finding himself abandoned and broken, and God finds him lost in the cleft of a mountainside and lifts him up and gives him new strength and purpose. Then there is the story of Jesus getting lost in the wilderness and finding himself too. In many ways, in these times, we have a sense of loss as we are exiled from our own building. And we experience frustration, we experience anger. Sometimes we are terrified about the future. Sometimes marvelous things have come out of being lost. And I think we are finding ourselves in a new center by rediscovering who we are and what our strengths are and what our values are. And I hope that in this experience of wilderness, in this experience of wandering, in this experience of being lost, and in finding ourselves again, when we re-enter our facilities, we will be able to re-enter them as a community profoundly changed, profoundly enriched, and with a profoundly new vision. But we are not the only ones who are lost. There are others in our country, people who live in communities of color, who have felt as though they live in exile in their own country too, who have felt lost, whose experience of lostness is terrifying and frustrating. And one of the things that I hope in these days, that as we experience our own sense of being lost, that opens up our hearts to their experience of being lost. And it opens up our hearts to a deeper dialogue and a deeper understanding of some of the conditions that we human beings impose on others. And then in our sense of mutual lostness, we may say, no, this is not right. And as Israel always experienced in their lostness the presence of God, so we may together experience God's presence, and out of our mutual lostness together find a new way to a new home. May God continue to be with us as we sometimes wander, as we sometimes get lost. And may God be the light that guides our path home. May God bring us to new companions and new relationships. And may we understand and appreciate the great diversity of our human family that God has given us. God bless you all. Amen.